The hated hill looked to most Americans less like anything involving sugar than a rectangular loaf of coral and volcanic rock. Stebbins and Damar weren't alone in wondering how such an object, seemingly less significant than the Kakazoo Ridge finally taken by the army, could cause such slaughter. To the 6th Division staff, it was merely a minor midway station wanted as a platform for fire support against a higher hill called Kokuba, about a mile farther south. Sugarloaf's 300 or so yards of frontage rose abruptly to a height of 60 feet from an area of plain before it, an unhappy feature to those who had to cross that open country, about the size of 6 football fields. The hill itself was low enough, especially in relation to the others in view of it, including the Shuri Heights, to appear almost negligible. A pimple of a hill, as one Marine would call it 40 years later, still trying to fathom how it could have been so evil. A young man in the good shape of all infantrymen could run to its crest in 3 or 4 minutes. Yet it would cost more casualties than any other single Pacific battle, on Iwo Jima or elsewhere. The next assaults were prompted not only by the continued need to take the hill for the sake of the advance, but also to stop its defenders from rolling hand grenades down on American wounded lying at the base. But shot to trash G Company was losing its power to attack on its own. Of the 215 men with which it had started on May 12th, down from a full complement of about 250, only 75, including just 3 officers, were fit to fight by nightfall. The summit was reached again the next day, but rapid counterattacks drove the attackers off. On May 14th, Sugarloaf became the focus of the entire stalled division. The 22nd Regiment was ordered to take it before nightfall at any cost. But more Japanese artillery from Shuri and deadly fire from unapproachable anti-tank guns repulsed every attempt. All approaches to the hill that gave the slightest protection of defilade were covered by intense mortar fire. In the late afternoon, the commander of the 2nd Battalion ordered the remnants of G Company to try again, this time together with F Company. When the force of 150 reached the base of the hill 2 bloody hours later, 106 had been disabled, together with 3 of their 4 supporting tanks. Amazingly, the intensity of the mortar and machine gun fire seemed to have increased. Although riflemen normally carried almost 200 rounds in their rifles, belts, and bandoliers, the counterattacks from the reverse slope and flanks depleted their supply in minutes. The open killing field was now littered with smoking hulks of tanks and casualties, who couldn't be recovered while it was still more or less light. Snipers were everywhere. But 26 men from a supply echelon now arrived with replenishment, and Major Harry A. Courtney, Jr., the battalion executive officer or assistant commander, had an idea. Courtney had spent the day and previous night with the forward units to bolster their morale after the loss of so many of their senior officers, especially G Company, which, after the wounding of Stebbins and Bear, was under its 3rd commander. Now he formed up the new arrivals with the survivors of F and G companies. Pressed against the base under devastating fire, the 28-year-old major told the group that he wanted volunteers for a banzai of their own. Otherwise, the Japanese would be down with a counterattack in the morning. "That hill's got to be taken, and we're going to do it. What do you say?" All said yes, and they stormed up after dark, comrades near the base braving continuing fire to collect the dead and wounded from the earlier attacks. At the same time, the exchange of grenades near the crest was at such close range that members of Courtney's group could hear Japanese grunting as they tossed theirs uphill. When Marines answered, their grenades raised so much dust that the hill slope was obscured. The dust turned to mud when a drenching rain resumed a few hours later. Then the rain of Japanese grenades and mortars grew more accurate. Courtney was killed by one or the other shortly after he reached the crest. He would be one of 4 6th Division Marines awarded the Medal of Honor, 3 posthumously. Dale Bear received the Navy Cross. The leadership passed to Ed Pesserly, another first lieutenant up from the ranks, who'd taken over F Company earlier in the day when its commander was shot in the hip. The thinning force dug in and threw grenades to try to avert an imminent counterattack by Japanese seen gathering in the light of illumination shells fired by American ships. A Japanese grenade in a steady barrage of them shot fragments into Pisali. Bleeding from the chest, he radioed Colonel Woodhouse, who told him to try to hang on. He'd get as much fire as he could from every possible artillery battery, Marine and Army. The lieutenant colonel stayed on the radio with him all night, calling in coordinates for that artillery. Shortly after dawn, a handful of survivors, some 15 of the 60 men who had stormed the crest with Courtney, withdrew, slightly protected from the severe Japanese fire by a morning mist. One of the lucky 15 was Wendell Majors, a G Company rifleman who realized sometime after midnight that he was the only man left alive on the hill's left flank. Private Majors began inching closer toward what he hoped would be friends in the center when a Navy Star shell burst into light overhead. He dashed for the cover of a shell hole, jumped in, and felt a searing jolt. A bayonet fixed to a rifle, one of many weapons abandoned in earlier seesaw charges by both sides, had entered the back of his right thigh and was protruding from the front. Another lucky one was Irving Oatel, whom DeMar had given command of a machine gun platoon in the emergency of the soaring casualties. Guys were all over the place, wounded, bleeding, dead, and the living could hardly move because you simply couldn't without getting hit. Then it got dark, and I stayed below the crest all night because the air was still really thick with Japanese fire. The platoon was down to a few men. We just didn't have any guys left. Those who were left had reached the limit of endurance. Corporal Dan Dereshchuk had been assigned to protect the right flank with 2 machine guns and 8 G Company Marines, all sunken-eyed with exhaustion after 5 days, with almost no sleep since crossing the Asakawa. The corporal had actually fallen asleep while digging his foxhole the previous night. He was even more spent now, and his face ached from shrapnel wounds suffered the previous day, but there could be no sleep. Mortar fire knocked out one machine gun, and steady firing burned out the barrel of the other. Dereshchuk's 8 men dwindled to 3, one alternately crying out and moaning from a stomach wound, which brought more grenades down on the 3 survivors. But they managed to evacuate at dawn. After the seesawing of May 14th, the 2nd Battalion was a skeleton, and the entire 22nd Regiment was down to 62% of combat efficiency. May 15th was no better. The pitch of that day's fighting probably exceeded any in the division's history. Furious artillery and mortar barrages met the units that moved out early in the morning. The Japanese counterattack that had driven the last of Major Courtney's group from the hill pushed forward until early afternoon, retaking some precious ground just north of it. By the end of the day, the 2nd Battalion had to be withdrawn because it had taken more than 400 casualties, almost half its normal complement. Owen Stebbins's G222 was down to 1 officer, a lieutenant who'd become the company commander, and a scattering of enlisted men. Further reduced by sickness and exhaustion, the battalion could field 282 effectives out of its normal complement of roughly 1,000 men. 2 boys had returned to combat that afternoon, their wounds from up north patched on a hospital ship and in Hawaii. Not finding their unit before dark, they tried to wait out the night in the safety of a cave. But since all were too packed with other Marines sheltering from the fire to squeeze in, they lay down just outside one of them, under a teepee formed by 2 huge rocks. A shell found its way even into what seemed that perfect cover, and killed them before they could rejoin their buddies. Only the Shuri line in general has been more studied by military analysts than its Sugarloaf segment, attention well deserved, for the skill and sweat of Japanese groundworks were in dramatic evidence here. The terrain favoured them almost by the nature of things. Defenders almost always fortified the high ground, toward which attackers had to fight from below, along predictable routes. In this case, the Japanese had a better view of the attackers than usual, especially from the Shuri heights that dominated the entire area. Their cave exits on the rear slopes and the flanks as well as the forward slope allowed defenders protected from American shells to rush out to counterattack Marines who had reached the summit, and in force, because the unusually elaborate network of tunnels provided safe access for reinforcements. In addition, their machine gun emplacements, hidden mortars, and other defensive arrangements had been sited with particular care, probably under General Cho's personal direction. The crux was that Sugarloaf Hill, or Heights 51.2 as the Japanese designated it, didn't stand alone in the defensive scheme, although the Marines began by attacking it alone. Much to the contrary, it was one component of a triangular system, including Horseshoe Hill on the right and Half Moon, or Crescent, on the left. Those two formed a funnel for pouring dense fire down on Sugarloaf, especially on every square yard of the summit whenever Americans approached it, as Sergeant DeMar and those who followed him discovered. The chance of surviving without a hit was measured in minutes rather than hours. Additional heavy artillery from the Shuri Heights behind Half Moon was less accurate on individuals, but more devastating to groups. More voluminous and more accurate than any previously encountered in the Pacific, the linked fire also ravaged troops attempting to flank Sugarloaf from either side. And since many of the mortars were on the reverse slopes of Horseshoe and Half Moon, they were largely protected from American artillery and mortar fire until Sugarloaf could be taken. Few Americans there, as elsewhere in the best Japanese positions, saw the defenders at all. We were fighting an underground enemy the whole time, one of them realized after catching on to their strategy. But the Americans could advance only by showing themselves. Hell's half-acre, the flat bare ground beneath Sugarloaf and the other hills, exposed them to simultaneous crossfire from the several interlocking sources, unseen and unreachable positions causing half to three-quarters of the American casualties. At first we were totally unaware of the power of the whole defensive line and Sugarloaf's part in it, Captain Stebbins would put it with restrained regret. It took several days to begin grasping the extent to which it was fortified with pillboxes, tunnels, mazes, and interlocking automatic weapons. It took another day before the mutually supporting system would become apparent, the key to the defence of that whole side of the island. From the air, the full line bore a resemblance to a series of spokes radiating down and out from the hub at Shuri. Sugarloaf was at the end of the one that reached farthest toward the western coast and Naha. That made it the key to the barrier protecting both Shuri and Naha, and explained Cho's personal interest in the preparations there and special reinforcements now ordered by Ushijima. The American response was less well conceived. No matter how heavy the supporting fire, a historian of Pacific combat has put it, a moment arrived when men had to stand up and run across naked ground into a level stream of bullets. But that moment might have been better chosen than on Sugarloaf, whose punishing triangular fort was further argument for devising something more imaginative than the 10th Army's bludgeon, for outflanking by the line with a second landing in the far south, as General Buckner's critics advocated. However, the pain at Sugarloaf and almost everywhere else in the Shuri line evidently didn't prompt the commander to reconsider. A few infantrymen in the fighting units began to wonder, when off the line for breaks between their maulings, why they seemed to be fighting a Japanese fight, almost hand-to-hand, despite their huge advantage in equipment and firepower. The much-vaunted, perhaps congenitally over-optimistic American intelligence had again failed, in this case to give unit commanders like Captain Stebbins and Sergeant DeMar any idea of the deadliness of the Japanese preparations. Japanese forward observers happened to use Hill 51.2 for spotting during their months of artillery training. Thus their knowledge of the terrain was such that they often didn't have to adjust because they fired on the right spot the first time. We couldn't have done them a better favour than attacking there, according to General James Day, who fought on Sugarloaf and studied it during many later tours on Okinawa. They had us beautifully zeroed in. Sergeant DeMar knew that without later study. It was like target practice for them from all those damn hills. They had every foot covered with grids. Above all, it was pounding from Shuri's big 150mm guns, hardly seen before in the Pacific, that made the battle horrendous for the Marines. As the crow flies, Sugarloaf was about a mile from the 32nd Army headquarters in the tunnel deep beneath Shuri Castle. The battles being waged simultaneously along the rest of the 8+ miles of the main Shuri line, separate pitched battles into which Buckner's general offensive had broken down almost immediately, were equally ferocious, though they seesawed less between attack and counterattack. The Shuri line was accomplishing for the Japanese much of what the French had hoped from their Maginot line, and that was far more Ushijima's feat than Imperial General Headquarters, since their support of him had been minimal for a campaign of such importance. Clinging to their fundamental belief in attack, IGHQ had resisted the Ushijima-Yahara strategy of a war of attrition fought from underground. Besides, they had already decided that the Tenazan of Tenazans, for which all possible arms and equipment had to be husbanded, would take place on the mainland. Thus, the Shuri line was essentially the 32nd Army's own creation. Almost 250,000 men faced each other there. Two great armies, in William Manchester's telling image, squatting opposite one another in mud and smoke, locked together in unimaginable agony. In World War I's deepest combat, Manchester continued, battalion frontage, the length occupied by the battalion's 1,000-odd men, was approximately 800 yards. Here it was less than 600 yards, about 18 inches per man. The military analyst Thomas Huber would agree. The fighting on Okinawa had features that were all its own, but even so its dynamics bore a startling resemblance to the fierce no-man's-land fighting of World War I. Almost without exception, the Japanese had constructed a fortified position on every hill and ridgeline, with other positions heavily covering their approaches. Taking each little knob and crease, even when only 10 yards away, was an operation in itself. A rear echelon army colonel who visited one of the line's easier sectors during a relative lull in the fighting was almost as overwhelmed as a civilian would have been. It was no miracle that two such congregations of men could cause each other so much torment. By that time, both had absorbed lessons that made the fighting harder. The Americans, among other things, had learned how to keep getting water and supplies to the front so their men could stay there. The Japanese had learned that the banzai attacks to which they'd resorted on other islands were far less effective than the methodical warfare they were waging here. Despite the Marines' conviction that they were being used for target practice, the Japanese agony was greater than theirs. Sugarloaf's defenders were remnants of the 62nd Division, which had opposed the American attacks in most of the South, reinforced by the 15th Independent Regiment, airlifted to Okinawa the previous July to supplement the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade that had been largely lost on Toyama Maru. Led by a highly skilled colonel named Seiko Mita, the 15th Independent Regiment was also suffering heavy losses. But the Sugarloaf complex had to be held as long as possible, and Ushijima committed some of his last reserves of well-trained infantry troops to reinforce the defence during the night of May 15th. They included a farmer named Masatsugu Shinohara. When the Americans had landed, Shinohara was stationed about 15 miles east on Tsuken Island in the Pacific. Tiny Tsuken controlled the entrance to large Nakagusuku Bay, which the invaders needed for an anchorage and landing supplies. Some 250 Americans set out in 10 yellow rubber boats to take the little dot on the morning of April 6th, roughly when Yamato was setting out for Okinawa. Its little garrison had a field gun, 2 heavy machine guns, and 4 mortars. As the enemy boats approached, Shinohara, leader of a mortar section, chased them off with some deadly rounds, after which American bombs shook the island for days, preparing for a second landing led by amphibious tanks. Of the defending force of 60, 12 survived to follow their orders to find a way to rejoin the rest of the regiment on Okinawa. Crossing the 15 miles in diminutive fishing boats, they snuck through the American force already controlling the Okinawan coast where they landed. On Sugarloaf's rear, southern slope, Shinohara and other Tsuken survivors crept through trenches to carry mortar shells to their positions. To avoid the enemy observation planes that seemed to be always hovering over them, they worked at night and tried not to move in daylight, except to fire their mortars. Their rations consisted of dried biscuits only. They had no sleep during their 72 hours on or beside the hill. Although the prodigious defensive works and their firepower dismayed the Americans, the Japanese saw themselves as children fighting giants. Still, Hill 51.2, the anchor for nearby Shuri, had to be held, no matter how impossible that seemed. Some remembered the feats of arms, courage, and endurance on the 203 Heights, a key hill in the high ground around Port Arthur, that the Japanese had simply had to take in the 1905 war with Russia, and did. Few hated the Americans now, there was no energy for that. But all knew the enemy, as obsessed with Sugarloaf as he was, must be killed because failure would lead directly to the loss of Okinawa, then the same kind of vicious assault on the homeland. Meanwhile, short rounds from the heavy artillery at Shuri inevitably killed many Japanese too. When Shinohara was at last withdrawn from Sugarloaf, 55 of the original Tsuken group of 60, including its commander, were dead. The Americans, even those who had landed on Okinawa loathing everything Japanese, retained no more energy than their enemy for the luxury of hatred. We were past that, past bitterness. This was simply the ultimate athletic contest that you had to win, a contest with literal sudden death and no overtime. After 96 hours, most Americans were too depleted to remember what happened with much clarity. Some could hardly tell in which direction they were looking. The mental exhaustion led to many extra casualties because not enough adrenaline continued pumping to maintain the concentration that would have prevented stupid mistakes. Most of the 22nd Regiment was approaching that state on May 16th, which some felt exceeded May 15th as the 6th Division's hardest day of the campaign and the war. Several companies of the 29th, including Dick Whittaker's, had recently joined the battle. Units of both regiments launched a general assault on the hill from the front and both flanks, and were met by crippling defensive fire. Replacements had replaced replacements, and reformed units were again so badly shot up that some survivors had to take their organisation into their own hands. The day's huge losses had again produced no territorial gain. Before dark on that May 16th, Anthony Cortese of Company 322 ran to the top of a little hill called Chocolate Drop and looked at Sugarloaf through his lieutenant's binoculars. He couldn't believe what I saw. It was covered with dead Marines. A few enemy too, but mostly our guys, maybe a few hundred in my view alone. Cortese also saw some Japanese rebuilding their positions and ran back to tell his lieutenant that Sugarloaf had to be softened up with more artillery before they went in. But the next day, up we go into the slaughter, just like the others. That next day, 3 battleships moved in close to blast Sugarloaf, Horseshoe and Half Moon with their heavy guns, while aircraft carriers launched waves of bombing strikes. Then all 3 hills were attacked. Cortese's company of 245 men ended with 3 fit to fight. 2 of them, including Cortese, quickly set up a machine gun to stop a counter-attack until yet more reinforcements could be rushed in. Dick Whittaker was told his go at Sugarloaf was the 11th. When his stint unloading invasion supplies on the landing beaches ended and he was assigned to F Company, 29th Marines, Private Whittaker was made a helper in a machine gun squad, charged with lugging ammunition to the gun and protecting it with his rifle. Both his cans of .30 caliber ammunition, carried in addition to his pack, and his own M1 ammunition, weighed about 20 pounds. But the hill seemed to him, as to all the others in the previous 10 or so charges, almost insignificant in size, especially in its present blackened, denuded condition. His platoon began attacking it shortly after 7 o'clock on the morning of the 17th single file, Whittaker third in line. Mortar fire cascaded on the little column as if the Japanese had been preparing for them alone throughout the night. Running, panting, sweating, thinking of nothing, not even of what his body was doing, Whittaker pushed forward and upward as if the absurdity were happening to someone else. 3 squads with 3 water-cooled machine guns followed a lieutenant whose name he couldn't remember, the young replacement having appeared only hours before to take over the platoon. The attack plan, to move right at the crest, never had a chance. Whittaker couldn't tell where the bullets and shells were coming from, only that he now understood the expression withering fire. As the men neared the crest, enormous and stunningly accurate fire from mortars, machine guns and rifles deluged them, shaking the ground. When they reached it, they were showered with hand grenades from unseen positions on the reverse slope. The next minutes seemed years. At the crest, the platoon couldn't unlimber their guns. Even if the right targets could have been found, It was impossible to set up the machine guns because each move out of a shell hole or scar in the ground brought another deadly burst of fire. Whitaker's gunner was hit. The new lieutenant was killed 4 steps in front of him. When the platoon finally did manage to set up despite the casualties, it was so outgunned that the men hardly knew where to shoot. Desperate non-stop firing burned out the barrels of all 3 machine guns. Whitaker realized that even if they somehow held on, the Japanese on the reverse slope would continue pinning them down indefinitely. He was frightened out of his mind, yet impervious to fright, because the scene was beyond his ability to grasp. Down the line from him, more men kept getting hit as they sought cover until someone, Whitaker thought a sergeant, yelled, "Let's get the hell out of here!" But getting out would prove harder than getting up. Whitaker and another private named John Centerfit picked up their gunner, groaning from a bad stomach wound, and tried to take him down to safety. Fierce mortar fire resumed the moment they started. Panting from the strain and from exhaustion, they took a measure of refuge in a shell hole. Other men passed them, carrying and supporting their own wounded through the smoke. "Corpsman!" they yelled. "Corpsman!" A corpsman was found only when the 2 crawled to the bottom and across a portion of the open killing area to the marginal protection of the back of a small elevation north of the hill. Without glancing back, Whitaker carried the noise of Sugarloaf's ferocious fire in his ears. It was not yet 8 a.m. on the 5th day at the hill. His 15 minutes going up, taking fire and coming down had been beyond belief. It would later strike him that war is hell was a silly metaphor because no one has been to hell with the possible exception of Dante. He would prefer hell is war, but such conceptual notions did not come to him in the filth and fear themselves, when nothing mattered that wasn't immediate, instant. One of Ernie Pyle's last observations on Okinawa was that life up there at the front is very simple, very uncomplicated, devoid of all the jealousy and meanness that float around a headquarters city. Men continued worrying about their buddies after coming down from Sugarloaf. Did we get everyone off? Did we leave anyone up there in that hell? Slowly, immense relief that his duty there was over for now began washing over Whitaker, together with a vague hope he wouldn't have to go up again. It was up to his officers to think and to order that the hill must be taken. He only felt profoundly happy to have made it down. Attack, counterattack, attack, counterattack. Each time units were pushed back, it was with many or most of their men killed or missing. The wounded were pulled into craters until corpsmen or fellow fighters chose a time to risk slipping out to them. Scatterings of unhit men left behind in holes fell asleep from exhaustion that conquered even fear of their hopeless situation out there all alone. Part of F Company would go up again, but without Whitaker's decimated platoon. Later on May 17th, E Company of the same 29th Regiment was driven off 3 times, the remnants by bayonet charges. Although a 4th attempt might have succeeded, their ammunition was exhausted, and too few men were left to spare help for the wounded. The Japanese didn't know the attackers could not persist much longer, because no more replacements were available. But their own casualties had been so heavy that the general in command of the defending force doubted he could hold on another day. Assembling the last of his reserves from the caves of Horseshoe and Half Moon, he told them that fresh troops would arrive in 3 days. Meanwhile, they must defend Sugarloaf to the death. After dusk, he sent them to reinforce the shredded units there. But Americans had taken enough of the little rises to detect their movement. No fewer than 12 battalions of Marine artillery fired violently on the intended reinforcements, probably killing and otherwise disabling all but a dozen. In all, 6th Division artillery fired 92,560 shells in the Sugarloaf engagement. That helped quicken the end for the Japanese the following morning, May 18th. The commander of D-229 Company sent half his men around the right side of the hill with tanks. When they had engaged the defenders' attention, he sent the other half, also with close tank support, around the left flank. That turned out to be the final charge. The 1st Marine Division's taking of Wana Draw and Wana Ridge at last had silenced some of the artillery fire from there, 2 miles northeast. Here, enough damage had been done to the Japanese guns on the triangle's other two hills to enable the tanks to work their way ahead, while 80 men from D Company ran up the forward slope to the summit. Although 6 tanks were quickly knocked out, the other flankers encircled the hill from both sides and fired into the Japanese positions on the reverse slope, while the infantrymen showered them with grenades. An hour of savage fighting followed, desperately brave Japanese squads attacking with satchel charges. By then, the defenders had been weakened enough for the Marines to properly dig in. By nightfall, the organised defence system had at last been cracked, after the hardest single battle in the Pacific War, and, by some measures, the hardest for Americans anywhere in World War II. The next day, General Shepard, commander of the 6th Marine Division, received a dispatch from his immediate boss, a Buckner subordinate. Resistance and determination with which elements of your division attacked and finally captured Sugarloaf is indicative of the fighting spirit of your men. Is my hearty congratulations to the officers and men concerned. That night, a newly deployed Marine sat in one of the deepest foxholes I'd ever seen, atop Sugarloaf. Now that there was time to look, Naha's smoking ruins, only 2 miles southwest, could be seen from the crest. The stench of Japanese corpses, piles of which had been collecting for days, and of American ones too, was indescribable. His own squad was down to 4 men. Flares from nearby warships kept the area as light as day all night long. We lost many men that night and the next day. So did other American units. The battle still wasn't over. Sister companies D and E of Whitaker's F Company took heavy casualties on May 19th and 20 from fire from Sugarloaf's rear slope, as well as neighbouring hills. Taking a hill was a very loose term there, Whitaker's company commander would explain, because our men hadn't gone inside it, where many Japanese were still fighting from all those caves. My own company had a night of terrible casualties after Sugarloaf was officially secured. There seemed no end to it. Certainly not the night of May 20th, when a machine gun squad was included in reinforcements sent out at 10 p.m., one of the rare American advances after dark, to support an infantry company that had suffered heavy casualties repelling a counterattack. The squad's sergeant had just managed to find cover in a trench when all hell broke loose between Sugarloaf and Horseshoe Ridge. General James Day's studies of Sugarloaf during his tours of duty on Okinawa, most notably 40 years after the battle, when he would command all U.S. forces on the island, were prompted by his old fighting days, when he, a young corporal, was wounded on the hill. Day would conclude that more men were killed per square foot there, mostly in the open killing area beneath the hill, than anywhere else, including the larger and longer battles. The profusion of casualties stunned even the toughest veterans. Nearly 3,000 were killed and seriously wounded, roughly the same as on all of Tarawa and more than at Casino, and up to 50% more than the worst battle for a single position on Iwo Jima. An additional 1,289 men were lost to sickness and combat exhaustion, but the numbers can't convey their effect upon the survivors. There was little hyperbole in a Marine's lament that battalions melted away, companies vanished. Parts of 4 battalions were mangled. Several rifle companies ended with a dozen men from their normal complement of roughly 250. In 2, not a single officer or staff non-commissioned officer survived. In many others, privates ended in command of their shattered platoons. In Marine Evacuation Hospital No. 2, 4 or 5 men receiving transfusions in shock positions on litters learned they were their entire rifle company's only known survivors. Medical personnel observed that their dismay was exceeded only by that of the Green troops who'd still been in boot camp on L Day 7 weeks earlier and were introduced to combat at Sugarloaf. So many tanks were knocked out that some companies alternated crews on the remaining ones. In the infantry, 11 of 18 company commanders, including Captain Stebbins, had been killed or wounded. Scarcely an original platoon leader escaped. Mommy DeMar was G-222's only exception, and he was a substitute. For the men who'd been pushed into this fierce cockpit for 8 days, a survivor would remember, it seemed like an eternity. 18. Close combat. Sugarloaf's seizure opened the way to other strongpoints. Something snapped for the Japanese, as they knew it would, when the pivotal hill finally fell. Now the campaign would move more swiftly toward the American victory that had never been in doubt. But that's the historical view, reached in retrospective examinations like this one, which are as distant from the war as the daring new swimsuit advertisements installed in New York subway cars during the weeks when the Shuri line was mangling 12,000 Americans. No one who dragged himself out of a foxhole at dawn knew that a climax had been reached around May 20th. The fighting remained equally desperate, if smaller in scope, at the hundreds of other fortifications that gave the campaign a fury, a storm of devastation, that surpassed the ground fighting seen anywhere else in the war, as Geoffrey Perret, a historian of U.S. Army operations during World War II, would write. Together, the two Army divisions east of Shuri took almost as many casualties as the 6th Marine Division on Sugarloaf to the west. The 1st Marine Division suffered more during the first 2 weeks of May than the 6th during the 2 weeks that included Sugarloaf. Okinawa's southern landscape was studded with hill turrets that repelled assaults like the posts of a pinball machine. There was the Chocolate Drop Wart Hill Flat-Top Hill Complex, the Tiger Charlie Oboe Hill Complex. There were Hen, Hector, Conical, Red, Nan, Mabel, William, Howe, and Dick Hills, Rocky Crags, Kakazoo West, Hills 60 and 178, Skyline Ridge, Ryan's Ridge, Gadger Ridge. Hundreds of ridges and rises festooned with hidden gun emplacements, scores of escarpments where the Japanese positions were just as murderous to those hit by a howitzer shell or machine gun bullet. The struggles for those places differed chiefly in their duration. The colonel commanding the Army's 383rd Infantry Regiment, which took Sugar Hill, 8 miles east of Sugarloaf, saw the greatest display of courage of any group of men I've ever seen. Radio Tokyo caught the incongruity of the lethal obstacles' colourful nicknames. Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop, Strawberry Hill. Gee, those places sound wonderful. You can see the candy houses with the white picket fences around them. But the only thing red about them is the blood of Americans. Perhaps that broadcast intentionally omitted such ridge names as Hand Grenade, Hacksaw, Bloody, and Tombstone. There was also ironically named Easy Hill on the Oroku Peninsula, where units attempting an encircling movement would take fire from fellow units, and Lenley Cotton, the boy who'd schemed himself into combat by going AWOL, couldn't fire for fear of helping cut down Americans. Cotton's platoon leader shouted for binoculars and someone handed him a pair. A bullet shattered his head before he could focus. On Charlie Hill, just before Sugarloaf, a squad of 16 flamethrower operators was cut to 5. 2 of those 5 were again advancing when a stunning barrage of mortar fire landed a shell between them, killing one and tossing the other through the air, the flamethrower ripped from his back. The following day, the latter was resting below the hill, nibbling at a sea ration. A shell from a smaller mortar hit the boy next to him in the back of his neck, blowing off his head and shooting his bloody brains all over the previous day's survivor and his can of hash. The rugged volunteer for the dangerous flame-throwing duty vomited uncontrollably. The fiercest artillery fire to hit Melvin Hecht's machine gun section came at 7 a.m. on May 21st. When it missed his trench by yards, Hecht joined an attack on a ridge slightly south of Sugarloaf, which had been more or less secured 3 days earlier. May 23rd, when the unit pushed toward the outskirts of Naha, was similar, except that several survivors cracked up under the strain, and one of the KIAs was good old Al, a staff sergeant who carried ammo when he could have been in rear echelon, a boy who volunteered for everything. One of that day's wounded had a leg blown off. They carried him into a wrecked hut and amputated with a kabar and pocket knife. Davis took it like a man and only screamed once. Tex Duriso sharpened the knife and off came the stub. Now 5 were left in Hecht's machine gun section, 8 having been killed, 9 wounded, and 1 more or less permanently deranged. So it went for many fighting units. While it was strategically downhill from the breaking of the Shuri Line's cornerstones and historically inevitable, very few fighters had any notion of that at the time. Most men in the lines on Okinawa knew little more than what was happening in their line of sight, what threatened from the next cave or rise or tree stump. Those who lived a week or more became marvellously expert in that, the constant proximity of death-honing animal instincts and senses into a new nature. By the time Dick Whittaker's company reached Sugar Loaf on May 17th, he well knew that the difference between life and death often depended on what we smelled and heard. Officers and non-commissioned officers learned to take special precautions because they were priority targets. When Owen Stebbins was hit on May 12th, it was almost certainly after Japanese machine gunners spotted Ed Ruess running to his forward observation post for their quick parley. Following the runner, they aimed for the captain, the top man. The Japanese were expert enough in eliminating leaders to generate privates' compassion for their superiors. Day after day, single shots took down sergeants and second lieutenants crouched with their men, and also communications specialists carrying radios and everyone involved with command. Night after night, infiltrators found their way to the foxholes of Americans who'd been carefully selected during the day. "I can't tell you how many lieutenants we went through," a company G222 private would commiserate. That was why distinguishing armament such as .45 caliber pistols were tucked out of sight, why Captain Stebbins and all other officers rarely risked using their binoculars, and why you never ever mentioned rank in the field, as Ed DeMar would put it. Japanese snipers seemed uncannily patient and skilled at selecting anyone whose loss was likely to hurt more than that of an ordinary rifleman. It was amazing how they could pick out anyone in command, sometimes just from the way they talked to others. That's why everyone tried to look as dumb and dirty as everyone else. Americans also learned to hide everything, maps, binoculars, stripes or bars of rank, that would distinguish them from foot sloggers. Salutes were anathema. Any rifleman who saluted an officer on the line, targeting him for an enemy sniper, would have been in deep trouble, William Manchester would note. Marine contempt for army leaders who supposedly put themselves in peril by maintaining ranks rituals on the line actually revealed as much about their snobbery as the reality. For despite the army's generally greater distance between fighting officers and men, its combat units fought the same war and learned the same lessons as the Marines. DeMar would remember laughing at, probably apocryphal, army officers who wore their insignia in combat. The day before we went in, anything and everything came off that could single you out. If you didn't know a captain or a major by sight and he came up to you, you wouldn't know who he was, and if you guessed, you didn't show it to those Japanese out there watching to see who gave the orders. That became second nature. Similarly, medical corpsmen tried to be known personally by the units they attended, so wounded men would call Jones or Bangert instead of Corpsman or Doc. Japanese soldiers sometimes shouted the generic titles in order to pick off the men who ran out to help. New replacements, however, often had no time to learn their corpsmen's names. Their failure to know and sense a great deal more accounted for the high proportion killed or wounded on their first days and even hours. Thousands came up to the front full of expectation and anxiety, saw the truth of combat, for which none was truly prepared, did something without the necessary artfulness, and, all in their first day, were delivered to a medical facility with grievous wounds and eyes still dumb with shock and disbelief. No matter how rigorous Marine infantry training tried to be, only combat itself could teach real combat smarts. The training had made much of never bunching up so that no single mortar shell could hit more than 1 or 2 men, but green men kept being killed in bunches formed of fright. It was only after they saw this happen that an instinct to stay apart developed, yet not too far apart, because riflemen needed each other's protection on every flank. Then that instinct was further refined, and they kept the optimal distance in varying terrains of plains, hills, woods, and escarpments. American infantrymen who survived a month in the line became as professionally skilled and personally cauterized as infantrymen anywhere. From the positioning of canteens to the placement of an extra knife under their shirts, everything they wore and carried was readied for the best chance to kill before being killed. Experience had taught that in this, all the skill in the world counted less than good luck, especially during an assault against a fortified position, when no one had any control over what ground a hidden Nambu light machine gun would spray or where a mortar shell would fall. Everyone knew that some of the most reckless men went miraculously unscathed, and some of the most prudent and expert were blown to bits, that practicing every measure of protection couldn't prevent one's own number from coming up. Still, expertise offered slightly better odds of surviving. Men had seen the slack of rifle slings spell the difference between life and death. Needless to say, they disagreed about such fine points as whether or not to tape down hand grenades. Many hung them on the handiest place, their pack straps, but others, having seen the terrible accidents they inevitably caused, feared they might explode there, or one would fall off. The trade-off, added safety versus a second's delay using them, was disputed, but not by those whose experience brought them firmly down on one side or the other, like those who did tape, but forgot to remove it in time and were almost finished by that tiny delay in throwing one. Usually you didn't have a chance to learn from your mistakes, Norris Bukta would reflect, because they got you killed. As in all modern wars, ears became acutely sensitive to menaces broadcast by sounds, especially of the varieties of incoming fire. Each whoosh, whine, and whiz identified a bullet or shell type with its individual trajectory and proximity. One low-velocity shell could actually be seen approaching, tumbling end over end. It was the new Japanese screaming Mimi, or boxcar, or garbage can, a 320mm spigot mortar detonated by a propellant charge struck with a mallet. The 32nd Army had 24 of them, their launching shriek, like a locomotive from hell, and earth-shaking thunder when the 650-pound shells hit shredded the stretched nerves even of the veterans who knew they were extremely inaccurate, unlike the little Japanese knee mortar, a simple, deadly weapon that gave almost no warning. Many veterans were also convinced they could smell the enemy, just as the enemy could surely smell them, the consumers of so much animal fat. Smell was said to be sweetish, a little like talcum powder. If you sniffed it in your foxhole at night, every nerve quivered until dawn, an infantryman would remember. And sure enough, you'd find evidence that your perimeter line had been penetrated. But you didn't need evidence, you had your senses. Combat also sired a kind of medical wisdom. Even at the tender age of 18, another infantryman would recall, you learned a lot about the different aspects of wounds and what reaction to expect. A wounded man able to walk with help or talk clearly prompted smiles. Those were signs that he wasn't in serious shock, but calls for mothers were ominous. People who called Mama didn't survive. The sharpened senses and new powers of observation and analysis instantly assessed the relative dangers of new strongpoints and terrain. A silent counter recorded the number of Japanese rounds expended, since the dreaded Nambu light machine gun, for example, almost always fired bursts of 6 to 8 rounds. Eyes almost automatically registered possible evidence of mines and booby traps. Bodies purged themselves of superfluous movement. A new semi-conscious process considered each movement before it was made. Should the window of that half-standing hut be peeked through from the left or right? Should the next grenade be held an extra 2 seconds to prevent the targets from throwing it back? Should it be thrown with the right hand or left, which would allow quicker operation of the trigger finger? Should the rocker head be jumped over in one bound or two? Is it time to move now? Is a sniper or machine gunner zeroing in? Bodies tuned themselves for supreme silence and stealth, which meant reducing combat gear to a minimum. Every day you learned more, as one Marine would put it, and the more you learned, the more you chucked from your kit. You lived by your wits, which meant travelling light. Gas masks had been discarded on the landing beaches, and the bulkiest non-essential equipment, such as supply packs with the extra pair of boots, quickly followed. Experience has shown that a soldier will not carry equipment for which he has no apparent need, a confidential Army report titled Principal Lessons Learned in the Okinawa Operation would confirm. Every essential item was fixed on the body or in the pack so that it wouldn't make a noise by moving or shattering. If you had to move quickly, even with full gear, the only sound would be your muffled footsteps, Whitaker would remember. With some of their self-inflation also discarded, the Marines came closer to their image of themselves as the best fighters in the world, although the more worldly would later doubt whether they'd been better than the best Japanese. Veteran infantrymen would realize how much combat had changed them, almost into a new species with vastly developed physical senses, and almost everything else, including ethical considerations, shed like hazardous baggage. Although that was nothing new in war, this longest, largest, most intense land campaign in the Pacific reduced more participants to such a primitive state. Infantrymen on Okinawa came to feel that their changed muscles, senses, instincts, everything, had been designed for war and savage war alone, and that this was almost natural. Norris Buchter's first view of combat veterans on Guadalcanal, where the 6th Marine Division was being formed, had frightened him. They were jungle animals, nothing we could relate to, nothing to fool around with, really tough and probably on the verge of going wacky from battle fatigue. You knew they belonged to another world. After his 6 weeks on Okinawa, he heard a replacement speak of his own group just that way, and realized they'd had to become those same new creatures. It's from living on the edge too long, using your wits each minute to survive. It's watching, listening, thinking of what to expect next. Not like just an animal, but a hunted animal. You've seen so much horror. It's just a different life, indescribable. Heightened instincts or not, men in the lines had a more limited perspective than almost anyone farther removed, perhaps because ignorance of events outside the immediate environment was necessary to free minds for the requisites of survival. Owen Stebbins felt his men's real life was generally 20 yards on either side of their foxholes, and Manchester agreed. No Marine in the middle of a firefight, however clever he may have been, knew any more about the foe than the rifleman in the next foxhole. Many on Okinawa literally didn't know where they were during the fighting. I obviously knew when we got into Naha, one would recall. Otherwise, I had almost no idea. We weren't told, and maybe we didn't want to know or couldn't know. Our minds were full of other things. Without ever hearing Napoleon's saying about the combat soldier seeing only the pack of the man in front of him, Dick Whittaker knew exactly what it implied. Maybe the Japanese knew more than we did. At least they might have recognized some landmarks. This was the hill they used to watch the stars from. That was the road they used to take to the beach. We didn't even know where we were or what lay beyond the nearest trees. All we had was a grunt of "follow me" from somebody in front, and a hope that he knew where the hell he was going, which he often didn't. Hundreds of men died on Sugarloaf, never having heard its nickname. Many survivors never learned details that would roll from the tongues of war buffs. Superiors didn't necessarily keep information from the participants out of calculation. It was just as likely to be a sharing of ignorance. I think one of the reasons we were never told anything was that nobody knew anything. Stuart Upchurch, who turned 18 5 days after L-Day, would conclude, "I followed orders, not knowing what they meant," a Sugarloaf survivor from another company would recall. "When my platoon sergeant said we were taking Hill 63 tomorrow morning, that meant nothing to me. Hill 63 was just another ugly mound with blackened tree stumps that you and your guys had to crawl up, hoping it wouldn't be your last." Private Thomas Hanaher of Minnesota would become one of the campaign's more thoughtful veterans, remembering with horror the cost to his friends and to Okinawans. But during the fighting itself, he was almost wholly unaware of most concerns larger than keeping his head down and his weapon oiled. Hanaher's private world was his battery of 75mm pack howitzers, which operated closer to the infantry than any other artillery apart from the 37mm and heavy mortars. Still, that was a precious few hundred yards from the much more awful front lines. One ridge made a huge difference. It was no lark for us, another artilleryman would remember. We lived with quite enough danger even when we weren't being shelled. A man on the gun next to mine was killed by muzzle blast, for example. But we didn't have that constant feeling of imminent death, counting your days because they're numbered. When we saw those ragged, groggy infantrymen trudging somewhere, we felt real admiration for them. They were on the fighting edge, the real war, and we felt proud to support them, but from a different world. American infantry got huge support from those close-range howitzers, in addition to long-range artillery, the naval flotilla's massive guns, and the swarms of army, marine, and naval aircraft. But as the writer Bill Ross said about Iwo Jima 2 months earlier, the ultimate weapon on Okinawa remained a young man with a rifle. That was why infantry officers, those most perishable creatures, looked a little down on all others, even those in tank units. "Land had to be seized and held," said Owen Stebbins. "That was the only way the war could be won, on the ground." The proximity to the Japanese on the ground depended on whether they'd fortified an area and when they decided to make a charge. At the moments of contact, it was often close enough for Whitaker to hear Japanese songs, whispers, the clatter of utensils, and once a shout of "Babe Ruth eat trash!" If you left your foxhole and advanced, sooner or later you'd meet a Japanese who was out there with a single purpose to kill you. That's how close, the 20 or 30 paces, you could lob a grenade. Sometimes you didn't have time to aim your weapon, you just fired and fired from any possible position and hoped your buddies kept pouring it on while you reloaded. Close was what it was all about. That's how you took ground. The infantrymen who did that also often hugged the ground as tightly as they could. Very occasionally, something drove a sprinkling of them to the kind of feat dramatized in war movies, an unmanageable surge of adrenaline or exhaustion even beyond the ordinary, or nerves snapping because they couldn't stand the terror of being pinned down any longer. Sometimes it was a saintly calculation that all would die unless one took an otherwise lunatic risk. Okinawa's heroes disagree about why they performed their wild acts of gallantry. Some mention devotion to their beloved unit, whom an evil enemy was trying to kill. One former sergeant who charged Sugarloaf, although dazed with exhaustion, swears it was all a mistake because he'd intended to run away from the fire instead of toward it. Then, when all the Americans near him were shot, he lay down, absolutely quivering with terror. Mistakes, lack of imagination, and stupidity were indeed among the explanations for supreme courage. Some men couldn't imagine themselves dead, or the decisions to risk everything were made because the fighters just became too utterly disgusted with the battlefield's unspeakable existence, as one would modestly interpret his action. They became so full of revulsion against that hideous life that anything was preferable. Some heroes appeared unnatural to average infantrymen. When one future winner of the Navy Cross stood up like a bear with his bayar, shouting, "Come on out, you soldiers!" A machine gunner who would later offer that description watched in wonder. A man who stood up on the front line day after day almost looked like he wanted to get killed. He must have had a screw loose. No sensible man would do those things. Some of that species of hero would become problems back in civilian life. Whatever the reasons, a handful bolted from their cover on a few occasions and charged enemy positions, shouting and firing. Those rare exceptions fill much of the standard American accounts of the battle, such as a lore-filled homage by James and William Belotti titled Typhoon of Steel, which is rich in give-'em-hell action scenes where the good guys stand tall and dish it out. "Let's go, men," reads a typical passage describing an officer leaping to his feet and running into a deadly ravine. When superiors heard of such exploits, a medal was possible, even the Congressional Medal of Honor, of which 23, the largest number of any campaign in the war, were awarded for conspicuous gallantry on Okinawa. They served as the material for the bulk of traditional battle literature, filled with storybook warriors shouting inspirational challenges or curses as they wielded their weapons like figures from manly dreams, down to grins as they took on the enemy and stopped them with a blaze of glory. But battlefield men knew that bravado, even without the comic book dialogue, was no more typical than decorations were an accurate record of heroism. While a top-heavy percentage went to officers in command posts 200 yards behind the line, many heroic acts out in front went unrewarded because no one survived to witness them. I saw men do braver things than those who got the highest decorations but were never cited, an Okinawa veteran would recall. Besides, decorations tend to romanticize the hellish misery called war. Combat infantrymen learned the luck that helped determine who won medals was as unfair as in the matter of who survived and who didn't. Some of the bravest men walked away after their heroic acts, wanting and getting no reward other than saving their comrades. Major Courtney, as mentioned, assigned Corporal Dan Dereshuk to protect his right flank on Sugarloaf, and Dereshuk's 8 men dwindled to 3, one with a bad stomach wound. All night, the 2 utterly exhausted and partially wounded fit heroes kept the Japanese at bay with rifles and hand grenades. After their evacuation at dawn, Dereshuk was patched up and returned to combat without rest or citation. Whatever the merits and demerits of awards, the rare courage of the standouts represented a tiny fraction of the total man-hours on the line. A military historian's study concluded that only a quarter of men under fire in World War II and the Korean War fired back. The majority were too frightened to put into practice their intense training focused on precisely that. Although Army and Marine infantrymen surely performed far better on Okinawa, they spent much more time taking cover than leaping up from it. The Whitakers dug into the ground, vision restricted to the patch of charred terrain they could see from the lips of their foxholes, with no glimpse of the larger picture. In that sense, this account is as misleading as all others about the war in the killing zone, because the real war will never get in the books, as Walt Whitman, a hospital nurse during the Civil War, declared. Those about combat are in a way its reverse, and to the degree that the Battle of Okinawa was harder than its predecessors, that's more than ordinarily true about this one. News of Nazi Germany's collapse and of VE Day had reached Okinawa the day before Paul Dunphy scouted beyond the Asakawa, 4 days before Sugarloaf. Many of the ships in the bays held services of Thanksgiving, and battleships and cruisers joined field artillery in sending a huge salvo at enemy positions. The Japanese had no idea what prompted the earth-shaking thunder, but neither did many Americans on the ground, and even those who did know didn't much care. To men soaked with rain, covered with mud, and peering ahead for a glimpse of a rifle pointed at them, Europe meant little more than a place that was draining off the best supplies. To hell with that war, this is the one I'm worried about. Dick Whittaker felt the defeat of Nazism was happening on another planet. We didn't think much about what was happening on the next hill, not to mention Germany. They told us it was all over in Europe, but it sure as hell wasn't all over for us, another Sugarloaf survivor would remember. The thing we really cared about was how soon some troops would be here from Europe to help us out. The death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12th, almost a month earlier, had had greater significance for many fighters, most of whom had known only one president in their lives. But it was on the anchored or patrolling ships that the greatest grief was felt, or in the supply and reserve forces. Still, while many wept who weren't in the line, those who were felt only some pangs of sadness between dodging bullets and shells. They were too busy trying to catch their breath, catch some sleep, and stay alive. In America, Roosevelt's death and VE Day were among the events that helped keep the desperate hardships on Okinawa from reaching the public consciousness. The president's funeral, daily new evidence of the collapse of German defenses, and Harry Truman's early weeks in the White House seemed more important and relevant news. Throughout the first month of fighting on Okinawa, editors who'd long given greater prominence to the European war kept that up by allotting much more space to the dramatic assault on Berlin and the German surrender. Compared to that, the Okinawan campaign was just another slog on a remote island. The greatest land-sea-air battle in history was usually reported on inside pages, and attention quickly shifted to new, again more dramatic stories of the Nazi death camps, Europe's future, and the imminent invasion of the Japanese mainland. Although Okinawa was now what a historian would call the vortex of the war, that recognition would never enter the public consciousness. Few dispatches from the island offered clues to the nature of the fighting. Almost all conveyed an optimistic summary of its overall progress and provided colour about men interviewed behind the lines. Reporters weren't exactly prevaricating in that. It's worth repeating that most military service in 1945 was quite different from actual fighting. Combat, the real thing, had always been a relatively small part of military life, involving far fewer soldiers for far fewer days than its planning. Armies prepared by drilling, conferring, and cleaning latrines. Only the men on their outer edges fell to bludgeons, swords, scimitars, and arrows. And since more sophisticated weapons required more personnel to transport and service them, technological development further reduced actual combat's proportion. The worst of war is hell, but there isn't much of the worst. And not many soldiers experience even that much, a journalist veteran summarized. Or, as Edward N. Luttwak put it, battle is no more characteristic of war than copulation is of marriage. Luttwak, a student of military affairs, argued that this helps explain why combat remains part of the human experience, instead of being swept away by the outrage of those who have been in its hell and have come back to tell the tale. The Americans who fought their way past the deadly Okinawan caves represented a tiny fraction even of those serving in the Pacific at the time. On average, each was supported by 19 others, usually from a considerable distance. Most of those 19 endured varying degrees of discomfort, but were as spared from the real horror as civilians. It was only within rifle range of the enemy where life became unlike anything previously imagined. Most reporters ventured no closer than 500 yards. Ernie Pyle went farther than most. World War II's most celebrated American correspondent landed on Okinawa on L-Day afternoon and quickly began filing stories with his flair for the intimate. Almost single-handedly, he'd compelled Congress to award mud-slogging doughboys the combat infantryman's badge and extra pay. The Marine establishment declined both, asserting that all Marines were combat troops. As in the European theatre, where he'd won his name and affection by writing from ground level rather than command heights, Pyle appeared to tell it like it was. Infantry's Friend even toured a sideshow on the little island of Iishima, just 4 miles from the Motobu Peninsula in the north, where the Marines had overcome Colonel Udo's mountain artillery. Iishima, one of several offshore islands close enough to be almost extensions of Okinawa, accommodated Asia's largest airfield on its 11 square miles. Photographic evidence indicated it was undefended, which seemed confirmed by an absence of fire on attacking American planes. Actually, a strongly fortified mountain overlooked the field. Pyle stepped ashore on April 17th. The next morning, a machine gun fired on the jeep, taking him toward the fighting. It killed the most famous and beloved civilian of all the United States services. According to a respected military historian, the shock brought the Okinawan campaign to the attention of millions back home. Not really. The loss of that single life simply became news while battles that were taking thousands and locking tens of thousands in daily agony remained nearly unknown. In 6 days of fighting on Iishima, 240 Americans were killed and 1,000 wounded. The New Yorker's John Lardner called it a quick and otherwise unnoteworthy little special campaign, except for Pyle's death. The irony is that Pyle's dispatches from Okinawa, as elsewhere, were far too pretty to convey any real sense of the fighting. Although his stories came a tad closer to the filth and pain than most others, they still missed by a mile, as they had to. It's humiliating to look back at what we wrote during the war, a Canadian reporter would later admit. It was crap, and I don't exclude the Ernie Pyles. I suppose there wasn't an alternative at the time. It was total war. But for God's sake, let's not glorify our role. It wasn't good journalism. It wasn't journalism at all. As for Pyle in particular, Paul Fussell fairly likened his copy to emissions from the Office of War Information. Dispatches from Okinawa outdid themselves in masking rather than conveying the hardships, partly because they were so extreme. Whatever few facts they supplied, their tone and assumptions fed the usual cheerleading prevarications. A few non-professionals who took the trouble to jot down their impressions got much closer to the truth, as in an officer's notes about the demolished village of Gusukuma. Accredited correspondents omitted almost all such details, and without the almost when describing the home team. Most of their human interest stories and Hi Mum features about hometown boys could only mislead readers about life in the field, not to mention Japanese behavior. There was no mention of all-night retching with disease and fear, no moans or screams or mental disintegration, let alone shot-off faces and testicles. Despite Pyle's half-step closer to some aspects of the real thing, his outlook helped explain why Europe's less grueling and cruel fighting got more recognition. Sent to the Pacific in late 1944 under heavy official pressure, he continued to believe the European war was more important. And his treatment of Okinawan civilians helps explain why the major story of the campaign, measured in real human interest, wasn't told at all to the good folks back home. His little vignettes had Okinawans going their oriental inscrutable ways, while they were actually suffering horrendously. Even the best journalism in the most authoritative pages now reads like fluff. Battle hardships were couched in images of a hard-fought but essentially sane sporting event. Leathernecks and doughboys of the 10th Army held the Japanese key fortress of Shuri in a giant cup-shaped pincers today as they turned both ends of the Okinawa battle line. Pyle's accounts of Americans' misery ventured all the way to the infernal biting of Okinawan fleas and mosquitoes, as if that was what distinguished infantrymen's ordeal from normality. The reality later revealed in the memoir of Eugene Sledge, a pious 18-year-old Marine, would have almost nothing in common with the dispatches filed at the time. "I felt sickened to the depths of my soul," Sledge wrote of his first taste of combat. "I asked God, why? I had tasted the bitterest essence of the war, and it filled me with disgust." The why of ignoring war's bitterest essence is easier to explain than the why of war itself. Reporters played on the same team as the fighters, or didn't get to the game. Having provided exclusive access to the material, the military exercised tight control on how it was written up. A maverick convinced the truth was more important and courageous enough to defy all convention of supporting the American side wouldn't have lasted long. The great war correspondent John Steinbeck knew that the foolish reporter who broke the rules would not be printed at home and in addition would be put out of the theatre by the command. We were all part of the war effort. David Lloyd George had put the reality in a nutshell. The correspondents don't write, and the censorship would not pass the truth. Whitaker's cheery letters home also left the bitter essence unmentioned. Even with the talent to convey it to outsiders, he'd not have wanted to attract the censor's attention or distress his parents. Other letter writers tried to hint that there was much to tell, but despaired of communicating its immensity. "So far I have been very lucky," went a typical passage on Red Cross stationery. "And I know it is because of all your prayers and mine. I have a lot to tell you when I am in a position to, and that isn't right now." But that writer, like most survivors when they returned, would never be able to tell his family, despite their great closeness. There was no way to describe it because it was beyond every imaginable aspect of life. Or, in Dick Whitaker's take, "It's really very hard to describe what it was like on Okinawa. Almost anything you did could get you killed, including absolutely nothing." All of that gave the home front, less equipped to picture Pacific conditions to begin with, a much vaguer notion of the fighting on Okinawa than it had of more familiar Europe. The American public was further disadvantaged because generations had been protected from bombing, shelling, and mutilation. Apart from the minority who fought, they were largely conditioned to assume war's victims to be mostly the enemy, who'd brought things on themselves. But even if reporters had lived on the killing edge and could have reported honestly, the battle's ways differed too greatly from anything their audience could have imagined from newspaper or radio copy. Almost all infantrymen at the Shuri line periodically felt the experience wasn't happening because it couldn't, it was too unnatural. Most of Okinawa's heavy annual rainfall came during the 4 weeks or so that usually began in May, when skies could deposit 10 inches a day. The spring of 1945 happened to be much wetter than usual. Low-lying clouds delivered ceaseless deluges day after day. One writer claimed all previous rainfall seen by Americans was reduced to the status of Scotch mist. Even without a sharp wind lashing their faces with drops, they were often too dense to make out fellow platoon members in neighbouring foxholes, and they made fires for coffee and hot food impossible. Ponds of ochre floodwater on the lowlands became lakes that swallowed 8-wheel trucks. Replacement troops dug their first foxholes, took cover in the soup-like mud, and were in water to their waists within an hour. Elsewhere, the ground was everywhere so slippery that some men used their precious rifles as walking sticks. No one on the line had a moment's escape from the all-submerging mud. "You were knee-deep in it," Joseph McConville would remember. "Sometimes you slept standing up in it." Day after day, men shivered in their puckered skin. An outbreak of typhoid occurred during those downpours. Jungle rot spread from feet to the crotch. Ringworm in the belt area was sometimes so painful that combat troops couldn't wear their packs or cartridge belts. In World War I, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and mud was called trench foot. Now it was immersion foot, and dry feet became a longed-for luxury. Dick Whittaker's reeked of mud and the sweat of exertion and fear. He wore the same socks and the same underwear for weeks. Men who found streams for washing on their breaks from fighting had to cut off their socks. When a jeep towed up a large tank of water one day to where Whittaker's platoon had been pulled back from the line, each man was allotted a helmetful. Whittaker had a bath with his and felt gloriously clean. Then he dressed, saving for last a pair of treasured clean socks he'd been carrying in his pack. Standing on a tall rock, he lost his balance, pulling on the second one, and fell into a pond of muck. It was much more tragic than funny at the time, too much like the rifles that fell into the same stuff when a bullet or shell knocked their users flat, then wouldn't fire. When enemy soldiers on Sugarloaf approached one man whose rifle was useless with mud, he frantically kicked the bolt home with his foot, then had to hope it wouldn't explode in his face when he fired. He was lucky. He kept kicking and firing. The battles for Sugarloaf and all the Shuri Line's other strong points took place during the most torrential deluges. Sleepless pilots would hear the rain beating down and wonder whether it would ever stop. They lived in a world of water and mud, their feet stuck in the gluey bog of the company street of tents, their clothing and bedding never dry. Those were the lucky pilots in the rear who had tents and bedding to get wet, so unlike the infantrymen. After charges at those strong points, clusters of survivors huddled not only in mourning for their dead and fear for themselves, but also in the cold rain's soaking, incessant misery beyond description. Battlefield mud compounded it. Vehicles using Okinawa's dirt track roads during the dry months produced a blinding cloud of thick red dust, which now turned to sludge that clung to everything. Men without a suction-breaking covering of burlap bags on their boots needed help to pull themselves out. Jeeps got mired. The trucks, tractors and bulldozers that came to the rescue were swallowed. Tanks disappeared in lakes of ooze. The need for ammunition and other supplies being insatiable, infantrymen, often near exhaustion from combat's physical demands and mental tension, had to take on the extra work of carrying as much as they could on their shoulders and backs, wading through quagmires impassable by motorized transport. Most of war's literary and cinematic dramatization blithely ignores that grueling facet of the infantryman's war, as Private Sledge would later call it. It implies that ammunition happens to be at hand whenever needed for giving the enemy hell. Every time veteran Whittaker would see a movie hero who never ran out of ammunition, he'd remember the way Okinawa's few moments of intense firing could exhaust the precious supply and leave him defenseless. The average infantryman, even those not lugging extra weapons like machine guns, bars, flamethrowers, or satchel charges, was a small arsenal. He heaved his way through the mud with his rifle, backpack, and a cartridge belt containing 8 to 10 clips of 8 rounds each, a considerable burden in itself. 2 to 4 hand grenades dangled from his belt, and since that supply could be exhausted in minutes during emergencies, only the weight kept most from carrying more. Whittaker had a constant fear that an enemy bullet would hit one of the grenades he clipped to his cartridge belt or pack strap. The combined load made very heavy exercise of combat's running, dashing, and crawling under fire. Whitaker's 2 steel boxes of .30 caliber ammunition were in addition to his other burdens. Although he and other machine gun carriers improvised cushions and shoulder straps, their arms felt as if they were coming out of their sockets after 20 minutes of lugging, which lasted hours, on and off. They were weakened by lack of food, sleeplessness, and at least a touch of dysentery. Hauling was even harder when much of the front was a morass, and when Japanese artillery, zeroed in on every road near the Shuri line, forced them into rice paddies. Carrying the wounded was harder still, and more nerve-wracking. Strong young men became so exhausted that they hesitated to put down their loads for fear they wouldn't be able to pick them up again. An ammunition carrier in another machine gun platoon would bear his load across one large rice paddy farther south, then fall to the ground. If a Japanese had come around a tree and aimed at me, I truly wouldn't have been able to move. It wasn't exhaustion, but stupefaction. Melvin Hecht, leader of the decimated machine gun platoon, found some humour in it. Here I am now 20 years old, and I don't feel a day over 40. In keeping with Murphy's law of war, mandating that those who have it worst should also be worst sustained, fighting men on Okinawa ate wretchedly. Combat so strained the nervous system that many couldn't swallow much anyway, despite their enormous expenditure of energy. All had almost constant thirst, and worried about supplies of water only less than of ammunition. The oily-tasting liquid was brought up in 5-gallon tanks. The grateful recipients dropped a purification pill, not always effective against dysentery, inside the slimy green trash, and drank as if in the desert. But many had to force themselves to eat. Basic nourishment was almost always available in the form of a K-ration in one's pack. The little box contained a sardine-size can of ungodly hash and cheese or ham and eggs, soluble coffee or lemonade, and some hard biscuits. The larger C ration offered a slightly more tempting can of pork and beans, but was heavier to carry, an important consideration to men who lacked the energy to be hungry and whose appetites were further depressed by constant fear and revulsion of the battlefield's sights and smells. Starting out thin, Whitaker could hardly afford his loss of £20, which was average. He lived for days on cigarettes, included in the rations, and on dog turds, fortified fruit and chocolate bars that provided quick energy and didn't melt in heat. You carried them in your pack until you thought you were starving. You took one bite and felt stuffed. Whitaker ate his single hot meal during the Shuri line fighting about a week after Sugarloaf, when word was passed down that everyone should assemble with his mess kit because a truck was expected with mess hall chow. No one in the platoon had a mess kit by then, the metal being too given to dangerous rattles. Whitaker did have his canteen cup, into which a scoop of hamburger meat was plunked when he reached the truck. Then an orange was pushed at him to cap his feast. Another man's single hot meal arrived by parachute, but some had no hot food at all in 2 months of savage fighting. Kitchens were closed when the going got tough. Mess staffs were shifted to combat duties as riflemen and stretcher bearers. Near the end of the campaign, a mobile kitchen was opened for a Marine unit that had had no hot food in nearly 2 months. A radio operator salivated as he speared a piece of hot cake, but he couldn't eat it, this time not for lack of appetite. Fearless flies, twice the size of any he'd seen in America, flew into his mouth before he could rush his first bite in. He didn't try again. Lice and fleas were separate, additional scourges. The fleas, generously hosted by native goats, infested the beaches, houses, villages, and now the foxholes too. Few infantrymen on either side were spared. The May 3rd entry of a diary found on a dead Japanese soldier noted the lucky break of being assigned no night duty. But it was hot in his cave, and there were so many fleas and lice that I couldn't sleep a wink. However, those 2 insects that increasingly tormented the occupants of the caves and foxholes played second fiddle to monster flies. Japanese soldiers had been harried by tenacious, seemingly angry clouds of them even before the fighting began. They were as big as horseflies, one would remember, with red heads and fierce, glaring eyes. They swarmed all over our faces whenever we came close to the piles of garbage. Flies had previously fed on native night soil and other decay, but not extravagantly, since pre-war Okinawa threw out little. Growing piles of rubbish and untreated wastes that accumulated while the Japanese soldiers were digging the fortifications greatly increased their number, but they were nothing compared to the treats of combat's effluence that now littered the landscape. Ever larger and more relentless swarms feasted on the garbage, excrement, and rotting corpses now strewn over the battle sites. When Americans were lucky enough to be pulled off the front line for rest and regrouping, only a few hundred yards back, but with less likelihood of being hit, hot coffee often waited. Flies would attack it even as it was being poured, although the hand not holding the cup was fighting them off with maddened waves. Whitaker was one who craved coffee, anything liquid, despite his dead appetite. But if you put down a cup for 1 second, you could hardly see it when you looked again. The surface was covered solid by huge black insects, or green ones. When marine units passed the ruins of a sugar refinery in late May, the grotesque specimens feasting on a thick, dark ooze that had run from smashed vats of molasses and now stuck to the boots of the advancing troops prompted fear of an epidemic. Planes sprayed the area with disinfectant. The Japanese, probably suspecting the spray marked the start of chemical warfare by the racist American beasts, began shelling furiously with the remains of their artillery. The Americans, having left their gas masks on the beach on L-Day, were equally frightened that the Japanese beasts would use the incident as a pretext to deploy their own chemical weapons. Americans believed the flies' trips from the corpses to their coffee helped spread the dysentery that plagued nearly everyone. There was also a mild outbreak of typhoid, caused by bacilli that fed in the native and military night soil. Weakness and loose bowels prompted some Marines on the line to leave their precious cover to run to a corpsman for paregoric. Many who wouldn't take that risk had to mess their pants. Whitaker was among the majority who had at least a touch of dysentery much of the time. On bad days he'd vomit when he lay on his stomach and lose control of his bowels when he lay on his back. He tried to do neither, to live, by finding a position on my side. Not always easy in a foxhole filled with mud and water. One product of the endemic dysentery lay before everyone's eyes and noses. Combat fronts had no sanitation facilities. When there was time and the risk was acceptable, a hole was dug several inches into the ground. During action on the line, however, the surface of the ground had to do for the hurried functions, the rain, shelling, garbage, dysentery, and rotting corpses in their various colours, making the land on which infantrymen lived all day and night worse than open cesspools. The pus and puke and slime and trash of 250,000 harrowed men mixed into the battlefield's seas of mud. John Keegan would point out that battle, always unpleasant for a minority of its participants, has increasingly become an intolerable experience for the majority. Modern warfare has transformed its environment into a hellhole even without the fighting. Okinawa veterans make the same point by suggesting that anyone truly interested in combat's reality can glimpse it in peacetime simply by living a week or two in a hole in the ground filled with water, mud, excrement, and gore, and listening to a recording of ceaseless artillery thunder. Without dysentery to drain your strength and swarms of flies feasting on the product of feverishly running bowels, without the maggots and stink of decaying corpses and the near impossibility of proper sleep, without even the shells, bullets, exhaustion, and fear. A short spell there, in a drenching rain and filthy wet clothes and without proper food, will begin providing an inkling of an existence not conveyable by words or film. Eugene Sledge, whose searing memoir of Peleliu and Okinawa comes closest, fought with the 1st Marines at Wana Draw, 2 miles northeast of Sugarloaf. The stink of one area's half-flooded garbage pit a little farther south was worse than most, but Sledge's life depended on digging into it for cover. At 8 inches, he encountered a mass of wriggling maggots that came welling up as though those beneath were pushing them out. He had to keep digging. Minutes later, his spade hit a rotting Japanese corpse. Dirty, whitish bone and cartilage with ribs attached, with an overwhelmingly nauseating odour. How I managed not to vomit, I don't know. Perhaps my senses and nerves had been so dulled by constant foulness for so long, Having to wallow in war's putrefaction was almost more than the toughest of us could bear. When volunteers to retrieve Sugarloaf's dead found the body of Major Courtney on May 15th, they had to break the future winner of the Medal of Honor's legs to make a smaller package that would lessen the danger of the dash back down through the Japanese fire. That afternoon, the exhausted litter-bearers hitched a ride back to their units in a raucous Amtrak with about 20 corpses and 8 inches of sloshing water in its well. One 18-year-old who had to ride above that well supported himself on a handle, but lost his grip when the vehicle climbed a knoll. He fell into the water, now full of maggots and body pieces. The putrid liquid rushed back at him whenever the Amtrak again made a climb, and the vehicle's roar drowned out his hysterical screams, so that his swallows and wrestles with the corpses continued until he blacked out. What I was thinking then, and all through these years, until the 1980s, was enough, we've been abused enough. But he was unable to mention such episodes for 41 years, until he fought to a breakthrough with the help of an enlightened veterans hospital. Men didn't talk about such things at the time because, Sledge would explain, they were too horrible and obscene even for hardened veterans. The conditions taxed the toughest I knew almost to the point of screaming. It is too preposterous to think that men could actually live and fight for days and nights on end under such terrible conditions and not be driven insane. But I saw much of it there on Okinawa, and to me the war was insanity. Recent films that have begun to show young men gripped in combat's pandemonium of shocking noise, confusion, and terror necessarily leave out combat's largest dirty secret, the pervasive filth and decay. Replacements making their way towards the front lines heard a rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. It grew louder and more ominous as they approached the heavy guns and the clamour of battle itself. The roar of tanks, whoomp of mortars, shriek of rockets, whoosh of shells streaming through the curtains of flame, and dense dust of cordite. Men in Amtraks sometimes couldn't hear their roaring engines over the din, which was heightened by shouts and explosions. But the smell hit before the noise began to daze. Manchester would call it a stench of piss and trash and rotting human flesh. You are with men, all of whom, like yourself, have some pooped in their pants and otherwise stink of battle. It was not an animal life, but worse. Sledge found his only way of bearing the monstrous horror of it all was to look away from it, upward to the rain clouds, and repeat again and again that he'd soon awaken from his nightmare. But the ever-present smell of death, the overpowering stench, saturated my nostrils. It was there with every breath I took. Coming from a culture that valued individual life, infantrymen took time to comprehend a world whose purpose was to extinguish it. But death became so common that they soon felt an odd dichotomy. They'd come to treasure the lives of their fellows, who could be lost at any moment, more than they had treasured any other. Yet all their lives together seemed of little consequence to the forces that had delivered them there. Especially heavy casualties among young platoon leaders kept the men from remembering their names or even faces, as when Dick Whittaker went up Sugarloaf. Those officers came and went too fast. Only 2 of the 21 Company 123, 22 officers who landed on L Day weren't killed or seriously wounded. Several companies replaced some of their officers 3 and 4 times. Second lieutenants in rifle companies seemed to Sledge a species made obsolete by modern warfare, wounded or killed with such regularity that we rarely knew anything about them. When the platoon tended by Corpsman Joe Bangert, the erstwhile wise guy, went up Sugarloaf, he couldn't tell you my own lieutenant's name because we lost him so fast, and so many others. Stuart Upchurch's platoon went through so many that we started to just ignore the new ones. They really couldn't tell us anything we didn't know. The smart ones did well to learn from us. The second lieutenant in command of the platoon of James Day, the corporal destined to become a general, was killed in the field. His replacement died of wounds in a hospital. Most of the company's other officers fell, together with many of their superiors. His battalion commander and the battalion executive officer died in action. His regimental commander, a replacement for one seriously wounded on Sugarloaf, was killed days later. Nearly the entire regimental command structure was lost, and most of the troops. Day's battalion started with 1,145 men on April 1st. When its fighting finished in June, some 3,000 past and present men were listed as having belonged, which meant each man had been replaced twice. On the day before Christmas, 1944, a furious football game had been played in the Mosquito Bowl, a field pounded out of Guadalcanal's coral. Thanks to the Corps' appetite for recruiting athletes, the teams were studded with former college and professional stars, some of whom considered that game, played without shoulder pads or helmets, the roughest of their careers. 14 weeks later, at least 12 of the 60 players, including all Americans and other captains of college powerhouses, had been killed on Okinawa, and the other 48 wounded or injured almost to a man. 31 received the Purple Heart. The spectators fared better only by comparison. Casualties among the 9 infantry battalions that watched the game reached 75%. 400 officers and 7,822 enlisted men killed and wounded. After a few weeks on Okinawa, a college graduate who'd been haunted by not making an officer realized how lucky he was. He'd be the sole member of his 11-man machine gun section not killed or wounded seriously enough for evacuation. He'd started as an ammunition carrier like Whitaker, but all 10 men in front of him were shot like ducks in a row. I was the last duck, but the campaign ended just in time. That was common. Melvin Hecht's 62-man platoon ended with 2 lucky ones. Sledge's company finished with 26 of the 235 officers and men who'd made the landing. The same percentage was left of Owen Stebbins's G222 company, 2 platoons of which ended with only 3 men from L-Day, one of whom was seriously wounded twice. Army infantry units suffered similarly, prompting efficiency experts who later analysed the campaign to recommend attaching a Graves registration platoon to each regiment because the personnel who dealt with the bodies proved insufficient and necessitated the employment of frontline troops to evacuate the dead. It's not quite true, as Marines like to remember, that they were stalwart to a man. One young private shot himself in the toe as his company advanced toward the Shuri line. His company had only 2 officers for some critical fighting a few days later, because a junior one mysteriously disappeared, in the company commander's words, after 4 of his 6 fellow officers had been hit during the first day at Sugarloaf. The missing officer was found to have turned himself in sick to his battalion aid station. An officer of another company with shocking casualties stayed behind to cover his men's retreat one day, until volunteers ran back with a poncho to drag him out from where he lay wounded. A corpsman later noticed his leg wound bore signs of powder burns. Of the 1,000 men who were pinned down by machine gun fire on the way to Sugarloaf and waiting for the order to push on again through it, one burst out crying, threw away his rifle, and began crawling to the rear. Also during the assault on the Shuri line, a fine regimental commander's failure lost him his command. After the Admiral's pressure on General Buckner to advance more rapidly, General Shepherd ordered Sugarloaf taken at any cost. When the cost became horrendous, the regimental commander in question, a tough, fully battle-tested Marine colonel, told the general he couldn't order his decimated regiment to carry out another attack on the hill. As with the colonel previously in the north, he was relieved, and his replacement did give the order.